Hello, my name is Ildiko,
And I'm Phil.
and this is the My Open Source Experience podcast, where we discuss all the things about the mechanics of open source in business and in communities. Follow the podcast on your favorite platform and check out the latest episode on Season 3. In this mid-season mix episode, first, Stormy Peters talks about social norms and some bad corporate practices. I think I saw an article that was diving into some of the challenges of open source from business perspective, and they had a Gartner reference that I think the number was 95% of the code base depends on or has open source in it that companies use, whether or not they are aware of it. So the interesting part of that paragraph was that it implied that companies aren't even always aware that they, pulled in an open source dependency or have open source code in their code base. So when it comes to maintaining these code bases, it doesn't really seem like it's becoming any easier. So I understand that we have more open source code all over. But when it comes to investing in that open source code base and maintaining it like it was your own proprietary solution, it doesn't really seem like a solved challenge even up to today. At least as far as I can see. There are companies who are in the front line of figuring out how to make it part of their workflow to make the process efficient and sustainable. But a lot still seem to struggle with the concept of even just fixing the bug upstream, either because maybe they haven't figured out the legal parts of it, but I think in most cases it seems like an overhead to them to do the work upstream. And there seemingly are uncertainties that they just decide that it's too risky for them to go down that route.
I don't think it's maybe it's a risk assessment, but I think it's just a lack of either rules or social norms. So I like to look at society, and some things are covered by law and how we've agreed as a country to behave. Like we collect taxes, and then we have a police force, and the police force has laws that they enforce. And even if you're born into it, you've somehow agreed to this system. Others are just like social norms. So if my neighbor leaves town and I watch her dog, then she feels like she owes me something. So maybe she, bakes some cookies and brings them over to me. And then I feel like the cookies was more than taking the dog for a walk for a day. So, I pull some apples from my tree and I bring them over to her. And even though we're not consciously thinking about it, we have this sort of like tally in our brain in friendships of how much each person contributes. If one person's always doing all the work in a friendship, it'll fall apart. And companies aren't people, and there's no social norm until we build it in the system. And so there needs to be a social norm of like, you contribute back.
And I think that's a struggle, right? Because of the corporate, it is the corporate thing from my experience. But I think we might actually be currently in an inflection point that's helpful, because we have so much open source in these various commercial products. There's to overuse a term, there's a level of lock-in when you do it and when you do it locally inside your company. If you take a bug fix or a feature and you actually put it upstream, then you actually open up the possibility for others to support your code for you, if you choose that supporting that code over time isn't something you're interested in. So I know lots of organizations who take a distribution from SUSE, or they take a distribution from Red Hat, they add stuff on top of that, and they may hack on the libraries that are inside of that distribution. And if they do that locally, It's theirs that they have to be responsible for all into the future. If they upstream it into that library's upstream, next time Red Hat consumes it, it'll be in there. And so they don't have to actually keep it and they can continue to have Red Hat support it. So as opposed to them doing self-support. So I think actually now might be an interesting time with additional motivations from a business standpoint as to why it would be economically more feasible to put something upstream as opposed to keeping it local.
Though I think the software that I mentioned before that helped manage all of the changes they made and then contribute them upstream, that was part of the problem, right? That new versions would come out before they contributed up, and then you have to make your fixes work in the new version. Um, a company that will remain nameless for this example actually hired interns to come in and try to contribute back all the changes they had made to code.
Oh.
Because they found that interns were attracted to the words open source software experience in their job description, and they had this huge backlog of tasks they needed to do. Technical debt, basically.
Yeah. And that's exactly the opposite kind of people you want to throw into that problem. I mean,
Yes.
some probably swam after flailing for a while, but mentorship going into upstream is so important. I mean, remember when we brought the deck team on, right? I don't know if you were still there at HP when we brought the deck team on.
I was there, but I wasn't involved in that.
Yeah, because that was cool, right? We had a lot of good, solid Linux people, and we had a lot of really solid engineers doing Unix that came in when HP acquired DEC, and they all came into the Linux team, and our guys mentored them into one of the toughest communities to penetrate, which was Linux, and they became rock star Linux contributors, many of them. That was a very, very positive experience for them, and it was all about the mentorship.
Probably win-win on both sides.
Yeah, it was.
Next, Magnus Buhrgard talks about the challenges that middle layer management has with open source.
In the industry at large, there's been multiple reports, year on year, identifying that of commercial software that is analyzed, more than 70% of it is open source, from a lines of code perspective. That's pretty well understood in many different industries, and I don't expect telco to be any different. But given that, I mean, it's surprising to hear you say that management, in your experience, isn't grabbing onto that fact and wanting to be able to figure out how to control that open source better, as opposed to building it themselves. Have you seen any strategies in that sense from your experience, either within Ericsson or from talking to other managers?
It's much easier to convince higher management, and they understand the idea and so on. It is the middle management that has a hard time. Like I explained, that you don't want the dependencies, and you don't really. But it's really hard for them to, although they will have to accept open source, that to get that into the official sort of strategy and so on, it's hard. So, and a lot of people understand it, and it's funny because you also get that for the designers. Some designers love open source. They love the environment. They like to be sort of work with others outside. And I never ever saw a sort of that they were disloyal to the company that they were employed by. It's not that, but they liked the atmosphere. They liked the international sort of communication and among peers in other companies and so on. While others were very much against that. They didn't like that, and they felt that they wanted to have an assignment and go along with that and not being bothered. So it's very much a different character for different designers, and that also goes for system managers and for managers, I think.
Next up, Samson Goddy talks about misplacing open source roles within the corporate structure. Did you have the opportunity, or was it ever needed to do some evangelism and education within the companies where you worked to help
Yeah.
them understand open source a little bit more? And also, I don't know if you ever had success in incentivizing or encouraging them to look at open source as a place to invest. Like if they are depending on a piece of open source software, then one would think that it makes sense to invest in it so that it is maintained, it is stable, it is going to the direction that they also would want it to go. Have you ever had those conversations?
Yeah, I have actually. I would say very successful, but then they realized that, oh, they don't need me anymore. Because the interesting thing is so I mean all the roles I've been working on, I've always talked about the importance of open source. The worst part about that is when I have to be in a different arm of the company that has no business in software. It becomes harder. They start looking at open source as a metric system, right? I don't want to mention the obvious, but I think people listening to me will understand what I'm talking about and the little shade that comes into what I'm about to say. So I think because of the way the smaller companies structure their open source movements, so if it's code, like if you're writing code, we could hire a software engineer, and even that's like I'm beginning to see that companies are spending less and less time. And my previous employers did that. Sometimes you get pushed to marketing because for some weird reason you could brand it better. And then the DevRel persona, like the developers relations persona that you possess, typically would want to come from marketing. So they want to take you to events to speak, and because you're speaking, they have this very niche metric system that may or may not be working. And then if you're someone that isn't very business minded, because over time, for me now, the good part about my career is that I've been able to adapt enough to understand, to speak corporates a lot. That is not what you see a traditional open source person doing, because they just want to write code and just maintain stuff, and that's it. But I would say that the corporate life have taught me that every single thing needs a little bit of justification. So I speak numbers, I speak effort, I speak results, long term, short term, very clearly. Every money spent, how to relate to it. So it's interesting, especially when the founders, or in this case, the leadership, and all. And I think it's another reason is because, again, fundamentally speaking, is because people in the leadership level have no idea, and they speak different language. So I think that's kind of where fundamentally things get wrong. But I've had success. I've had success. My current company, I mean, the fact that I've been here for 8 months now and do what I'm doing, and my role is very clear and what we're trying to achieve. I would say so far it's been successful.
Next up, Stormy Peters talks about the role of open source champions within companies. I'm curious if throughout your career you can identify any pattern that most companies were doing when they were approaching open source, either business strategy or workflow, that made them successful in what they were doing. Any commonality?
So I think most of the companies that are successful have at least one, if not a handful of people that are advocates for what they're trying to do. Like they have a person you can identify that got them into that project and really carried it through. So I think having a strong advocate is one, and then they have someone in management who's willing to invest a little, that's willing to take a, invest people's time or invest money, but willing to take a risk.
Do you mean advocate in the sense of advocate within the company to work on open source, or you mean the people who get involved in open source projects and become part of the company's success as they build up, their persona in the open source project and become that influential voice there?
I think a better word than advocate, I should have used maybe champion. Like there's a champion. So they might be the person that gets involved, or they might just be the one that's saying like, this is gonna work. Like this is something we need to be involved in. So like probably the person that you're going to talk to from Mercedes next is a champion like that within their industry or within their company, right? Like there's usually a champion.
Well, and do you think that skill set has to do with being able to properly communicate the value of open source in whatever aspect, be it consumption, be it engagement, be it strategic driving? And there's a level of ability to explain what open source brings to the corporate value, or what value the company can get out of it. Because I was thinking as you were describing it, and I would say you're one of those. I think I'm one of those. That's one of the things that I specifically do. And Dirk Handel, Nithya Ruff, we know a variety of people who have been successful at that. And I would say that they've positively influenced the organizations. And part of it is because they can talk in terms that are appreciated by business leadership. Is that a key aspect of that champion as well, or can they just be technical and passionate about open source?
I think if they're just technical and passionate, they're going to have to find a partner like you. Like they're going to have to find someone who can also explain it. I'm curious, that probably we don't have time to explore it in depth, but I was sitting at a dinner in San Francisco once at a table with a bunch of advocates. Like all of us gave talks on topics, and we realized that all of us growing up at some point had been like the only person of some sort, like the only woman in the room, or the only white person in the room, or the only Black person in the room. All of us have had the experience of being different than everybody else and having to like bridge that gap. It was a really interesting conversation.
Wow, that's cool. I wouldn't put myself in that category. I'm your typical white guy.
But surely you had some experience where you felt like you didn't fit, right?
Oh, I don't know. That's just imposter syndrome. Let's see. As a military person, as a percussionist in a professional band, I've got lots of imposter moments. Right down to maybe what I'm doing today. I don't know. But no, I'm going to have to go ponder that one, Stormy. I don't have to go think about it.
We can have another conversation on that some other time.
Yeah, I mean, I do have the experience to some extent because there aren't always that many women in the room. So that I share that. But even like remembering when I was working for Ericsson like 10 years ago, like within the department where I worked, like the concept of open source was very new to everybody at the beginning. And then I became like, my last role within the company was called OpenStack coordinator. They wanted to call me champion, but because English is my second language, to me, when you say champion, I think about sports. And I was like, I didn't win anything. It's not like I ran faster than anybody else. So championing something was different in my head. So I ended up with the title coordinator. It felt a little bit like what you were describing, Stormy, in the sense that I went to talk to the leadership team for that engineering organization, and I felt like I was an alien in the room who talks about something that no one else ever heard about, even though, the decision was made that the engineers will work with OpenStack and it's an open source cloud platform, but other than that, they knew that the term existed, but what it really meant in the background and why we have to actually do anything with it and work upstream and all those concepts, those were new. So whether or not I was the only woman in the room, the concept that I was talking about felt so new in that environment that it felt like I was an outlier in the room trying to help everyone else understand what I'm talking about. So yeah, and there were obviously people who were skeptical of why we should do anything in that area, as opposed to just following the regular usual ways of working that a vendor company in the telecom segment like Ericsson had at that time. So it was a very interesting experience. Next up, Austin Bryan shares his secrets to succeed with change management.
Any particular tactics that you found were successful? You know, the small proof of concept, you know, how do you get enough budget? You know, was it called a study? Let's go study to see if this is going to be a way to do this, or a POC, or what were the tools that you used, and did you have any success there, or can you point to any other stories of success that you've heard, you know, similarly?
Yeah, that's a great question, Phil. A great question. I would say absolutely do not do more studies. The amount of times I've seen the government and big corporations be like, hey, bring in a consulting group or a federal funded research and development contractor and have them interview people and write a study for 6 months. I will tell you with confidence, the people that are making decisions rarely read the studies that get written. They don't even read them. And I say it with confidence because I've been there.
What? All the studies that I wrote, no one ever read it?
They're well intended, but the problem is sometimes those studies, by the time they're published, the people that wanted them are already on a different job, and like they just end up. I mean, it is truly sad. But I bring it up only to put the juxtaposition with like what does work. I can actually tell you emphatically what works. Getting a system live with real users. If you do that, all the naysayers disappear because they can't argue results. And what I mean is the military is interesting, and typically and maybe this isn't unique to the military. There are so many stakeholders and not a lot of users. And I say that very in particular, like you get trained to make the Pentagon happy in the government, and the Department of Defense in particular, right? There's these people who control your budget, they control your money, but they don't control whether you're delivering value. And that's a very, very different thing. And I was able to, at the time I was a captain. So you're like somewhere between 4 and 10 years into your career. It's a great time to like, you end up being put in positions where you network a lot. So I knew people who were flying C-7. I was a acquirer, but I knew people flying satellites, flying C-17s, maintaining giant weapon systems. Their job every day was to like literally fly the thing or do the thing, right? I found they were pissed off about how bad their software was, almost through malpractice, had to find ways to deliver them software. But they were so hungry for it, they were also willing to take risks with their chain of command. You connect those two dots directly and keep all the stakeholders out of it with the tiniest thing, and they feel like somebody's listening and cares for the first time. They actually get it into the field in a safe and legal, secure way. They show their people, and all of a sudden, overnight, you're getting hundreds of users being onboarded to a thing. And then when you show up to a congressional staffer or Pentagon briefing, they're like, no, you actually can't do this. And you're like, I actually wasn't telling you, I wasn't asking you for permission. I already did it, right? Like it's already over here. And by the way, I brought my buddy who's a flyer and he's flying this thing. So you can't, like, he's here, I'm here. We're telling you that all of you in between us weren't helping. So we already actually went and did it. And all of a sudden people are like, I don't get a vote anymore, right? And when you have the operational community, or you effectively in the software sense, your end user with you in the conversation, that really blows people's minds. They're like, oh, you can't argue results, basically, right? It's like a data-driven decisions. You can't argue it when it's done. And I would say the magic, Phil, really was like finding a peer of mine who was struggling with the software they had in operations and being willing to like talk to me at 9 p.m. off duty. And I don't mean that in the sense we were doing something we shouldn't be doing, meaning like we were done with our normal job. Right. And we were deciding to take extra time to say, no, you and I can figure this out together with our teams. And if we do it and show the results, all those people in between who control the purse strings, like really control the purse strings, they'll get in alignment. And they did. Like when people see the results, And I don't want to underplay too. There was some stakeholders along the way in these key positions, Nick Shalon being one of them, but other colonels I worked for who absolutely believed in what I was selling and were like, I will take all the bullets and mudslinging for you. So there was definitely some champions along the way. I don't want to say they were all naysayers, but there was way more naysayers than there were supporters, at least early on.
But it's helpful to have those supporters because, yeah, skunk works without some level of
yes,
back support is just a struggle.
Yes.
So to sum it up, go find your allies throughout the organization. And if you're hitting a roadblock of sometimes a group of people, go around the roadblock as opposed to trying to spend all your time with convincing everybody with words. And along the way, try to look for a problem that is a burning problem, solve it, and then use that to remove the roadblock altogether. Somewhat.
Yeah, I always asked myself, like, and it's happened to me a few times in my career, if I got pulled into like the most senior persons in my organization's office and they said, why did you do this? If I felt like I had a very logical way that I did not break any laws that I did, then I don't understand why somebody's telling me no. Like if that, and so you get told no a lot and you should take, your first 20, you should not accept, right? And that would be my recommendation, right? If you're not breaking the law, which nobody should ever do, then you shouldn't accept no for an answer if you have a fact-based reason that you're trying to accomplish some sort of mission. And I think finding that ally and you two doing that together to get to that first win, like that is what it takes. And if you're lucky enough to have one of those senior champions, like try to throw them under the bus so that you can keep moving forward, because typically that's what they're there for. And like I said, there were some great leaders along the way who definitely enabled us. But that to me, right? Like get that win. Don't take no for an answer, right? Do everything you can to explain yourself. So,
in my personal experience, I had this a little bit in my, like at the previous company where I worked. I remember that when we started to work with open source, we started to get involved in the OpenStack community, and the company didn't really understand that open source software was looked at as free software, and there wasn't really a lot of understanding why we should invest the software engineers' time to work upstream. There wasn't really an understanding of that, and there was really no way of explaining that to management because they didn't have prior open source experience, and you could spin it in various ways. And I was very much of a software engineer growing up into a team leader role, no MBA. So I had zero knowledge and experience in negotiating, speaking business language and business terms. So all that contributed into my experience. That I think that's important to point out. So we managed to get somewhat around the roadblock by finding a component in OpenStack, a small project. It was called Ceilometer at the time. I'm not even sure it exists anymore. But the point is that it was a small piece. It wasn't in the core of OpenStack, so to say. So it felt that it was safe enough to put code in there, like we are not breaking any patterns or any IPRs that the company had, and the companies in the telecom segment. So patents and revenue from that is a key part of business. So not breaking any of those was something important for the company, and we did understand that. So we got around the roadblock by finding a little piece that seemed safe enough to participate in, and we landed a bigger feature. I ended up becoming part of the core team of that project, that little sub project. So we showed how this works. We showed how investing in that little component, now you had also influence over it. So the maintenance, adding something new, that wasn't just, my and my colleagues' job anymore, because what we contributed, everyone else we all maintained it together, and so forth and so forth. So we were able to get to achievements. We were able to show, I think we were able to show some value, but I think just thinking back and taking what you were saying, I think where the experiment sort of failed was that what we worked on wasn't really critical enough for the company. Like with that one success, and we contributed something that the company wanted to use. So it wasn't just like running off on a completely random idea. It came from, requirements in the background that the company had. But it wasn't critical enough to say that we see how this works, so let's do the same thing with the core of the software that the product was obviously fully, entirely dependent on. If that doesn't work, if things don't get delivered in time in there, then we don't deliver to the customer, and then everything falls apart. So like thinking of your example, it kind of sounds like that once you find the person and work on something that shows value, that solves someone's problem, you still need to find a way that is significant enough that there's just no other way around.
Yeah, the best example I'll give you of that for us, because you're right, like if it's not significant enough, if it doesn't make somebody's life easier, if value isn't delivered in the user's eyes, then it doesn't really matter. We internally in the government program office I was at, we were running Mattermost internally on our own like secure cloud that was authorized to like for our data level that we needed it to be. When COVID happened, we got asked by the Pentagon chain of command side, like, hey, the Department of Defense was not ready for people to telework by nature. Like most people didn't have machines. There's different data protection levels all up and down, what they call classifications, which all have different standards, that kind of layer. They're like, hey, can you guys allow more people to use your Mattermost instance? So we were talking like, we had 50 to 100 people talking about software development in Mattermost, linking GitLab issues at the time. Like we were just doing software dev flow stuff. And we were like, well, it's authorized. There's no reason we couldn't onboard more people, but we were running Mattermost Community Edition, which I'm very grateful they had an open source option for us, right? What we realized is high availability and data retention and latency really, really matters when you start having, 50,000 daily active users. Which during COVID, I think it was in the span of a few weeks, we went from 50 to 50,000 in like 3 days. And, but at the end of the day, we had what I wanted to get to was value. One of the specific things that happened was air crew that we have in the military, especially on the cargo side, whether people know it or not, they're taking cargo to all sorts of humanitarian and different issues all the time. We don't talk about that as a nation. It's a good thing that we do, but we have people all over the place all the time, not just what you hear on the news. And those people didn't have the tools they needed, so they may have been using other tools they probably shouldn't have to coordinate, semi-sensitive things. Let's just put it that way. They all adopted our dev tool that was Mattermost to just chat with each other from their cell phones, from their endpoints, because we gave them a secure backend in which to do that, to store their data. And that's what I mean with value, right? Like we actually, as typical goes in products, sometimes we launch this thing trying to help like office workers talk to each other about work during COVID. And all of a sudden we had 10,000 daily active users from the air mobility side of the Air Force, like coordinating air operations. And I still remember I woke up at 2 a.m. Some peer of mine got my cell phone number and was in a country I won't name, a very different time zone than me. So it was 2 a.m. and he wanted to onboard one of his users. And I was like, what? Who are you? What do you need? But I was adminning a Keycloak instance to give him, which I probably am not qualified to be doing, to be honest, even at this point in my career. And so it was a wild ride, right? Like and at the end of the day, though, those people then would come to my defense when I needed to advocate for funding from the Pentagon. So like it's all kind of spirals. It's like a positive momentum that starts building. And so, yeah, you have to deliver value. Like, and if somebody isn't willing to stand up with you in front of important people and say that gave me value, it's hard to prove it, right? Because even data can be I don't know, data, trust the source sometimes, right? But people's firsthand accounts, especially in person, like that goes way more because it's personal at that point.
Next, Tom Sadler talks about what inspires or keeps people back from working upstream. Do you know if there was any need within the developer and engineer teams on the production side to convince them that they quote unquote want to do this? That like going from working internally over to starting to participate in an open source community that can be global and quite large sometimes. It's not necessarily easy. In my personal experience, most people don't mind it and then they like it, but there are others who are just like, this is really not for me. What was the experience within the BBC on this side?
Yeah, I think for the most part, people are proud of their work and are happy to share it with the world. And earlier I was talking about the buzz of receiving contributions. Well, there's a buzz of your contribution being received. That extra external validation that someone not even in your company wants your code. So I think for the most part, yeah, people get it. People are motivated by it rather than put off by it. But there will be some people that do feel a bit insecure. I think especially more junior people, like, oh, I'm not sure I want to contribute this code. What if it's really bad code and I get shouted at for contributing really bad code? And I think the way to deal with that risk is kind of mentoring people and being aware of that risk, but also psychological safety. Psychological safety is a really difficult thing to achieve in general, but I think in open source communities it's even more difficult. And you hear horror stories about certain open source projects and certain pull requests. I'm not going to name any names, but I'm sure if we did a little Google, we could find some instances of very combative and antagonistic conversations on pull requests and issues. So it's so having at least trying to foster psychological safety within your organization can it make people feel safe that if they do get shouted at, then it's kind of it's not because they've done something wrong. It's because it's almost a bad community. Maybe that's too simplistic of a word, but yeah, a non-supportive community, and it's like, yeah, it's the community's fault for not being supportive, not the engineer's fault for not knowing what they didn't know. And yeah, I guess coming back to my experience with the Open Source Commons, I think we've always done a good job of being inclusive and fostering psychological safety, consciously or not. So mentoring people, but also preparing them for the worst and letting them know that it is a possibility, but reassuring them that it's not their fault. And we were all new to something once, and if people don't recognize that, that's their problem, not your problem.
But there's also a set of things to help them with as well, right? I mean, so, make sure that you've read all the documentation, RTFM, right? Mm-hmm. And you've lurked for a little while to understand, who these people are. And, if you know that this one particular reviewer, flames 70% of the things that are passing him, then you just know that you got a thick skin and this guy has a reasonable shot at flaming you. And it's not really that big of a deal because things continue on. Right. But, it's, knowing what the coding guidelines are, knowing, there's a lot of good prep that you can do. And if you've done those things and you screw up, then you know what? Hey, that was an honest mistake, And yeah, I had I had a guy who first Linux kernel contribution. He thought he'd done everything. He thought he'd read through everything. He made the submission, and the guy was like, well, "Why didn't you look at this? Because this clearly shows that it needed to be done this way instead of the way you've done it. What the hell are you doing?" And he literally was not able to find this piece of documentation that this reviewer was referencing. And so part of his fix was to help the reviewer out by making that piece of documentation much more easy to find for the next guy down the line, to which he was extremely appreciative. The reviewer was extremely appreciative. And yeah, they had a wonderful conversation at the next conference that they were both at, because we sent the guy to conferences. And now it's a good relationship that he actually relies on. He now has somewhat of a mentor in the kernel community because of that little interaction. But yeah, you got to approach it the right way. And yeah, in this case, again, he felt so bad when he first got flamed. But in the end, it wasn't really his fault. And again, and through dialogue, everything was done well. But anyway,
yeah, absolutely. You need experienced open source developers to mentor people so that they can be prepared for that. And reading the documentation is a skill, especially when you're reading documentation from a completely different company or community, potentially a completely different culture as well. Maybe the author might not be a native English speaker and might structure their documentation in a completely different way. All these sorts of different, just being able to adapt to differences, and not just not everything being how you're used to in your day job.
Next up, Magnus Buhrgard shares an example that connects research, open source, and product. You also mentioned at one point that you had, I think, a few developers working on open source, and then the group was seeing the benefits of that. Can you highlight a few of those benefits in that example, and if that had any impact on any of the surrounding organization at that time?
I think that some of the designers that were engaged in ONAP managed to get research projects into products. So there was a code that I had written as part of their research activity, and then they brought it up to a product and got it accepted in ONAP, and it was utilized in product. And I think I hope that inspired some of the researchers to go along with in the same way. I honestly don't know, but I think that's a good transition of knowledge from research to products, which is not an easy transition, of course. So that's the one example I have.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave comments under the episodes that you watched. Share your feedback and share your experiences to continue the conversation. And let us know what topics you would like to hear next. Stay tuned, because the next episode is just around the corner.